Okay, in this video, we are going to pick up where we left off on the endocrine system, and then we will introduce the lymphatic system as well. So we left off with the pineal gland. Now, the pineal gland is a very small pine cone shaped structure within the brain that is positioned below and slightly behind the thalamus. And because of its very deep central location in the brain, it is one of the parts of the endocrine system that is not fully understood. However, we do know that it plays roles in the light-dark cycle or circadian rhythm of the body. It secretes a hormone called melatonin. Melatonin helps to regulate the sleep-wake cycle by making us feel sleepy. So it does this because the pineal gland is actually neurologically connected to the eyes, and daylight inhibits its activity. When it becomes dark, this is when the pineal gland begins to become active and it secretes melatonin in response to the darkness. And this is how it regulates our circadian rhythm. So when it becomes dark, it secretes melatonin, and this makes us sleepy. During the day, when there is light, this suppresses its activity to aid in wakefulness. Now, moving down to the abdominal cavity, we find the pancreas. And it is a long, slender organ that is located posterior to or behind the bottom half of the stomach. So the stomach would be found right here in this location. And the pancreas in general has two distinct roles. About 99% of its activity is dedicated to secreting digestive enzymes as well as bicarbonate to help break down food for the digestive system. And this is an exocrine function. Exocrine because it secretes these digestive enzymes that it produces directly into the duodenum. So it secretes them directly into the duodenum, the first segment of the small intestine. Now, it also performs an endocrine function. So a smaller percentage of what it does is attributed to endocrine function. And this consists of tiny clusters of cells within the pancreas called the pancreatic islets. The pancreatic islet cells secrete hormones directly into the bloodstream. So this is that endocrine function. These hormones include glucagon, insulin, somatostatin, and pancreatic polypeptide. So one of the main roles of the pancreas is to aid in glucose homeostasis. So it keeps our blood sugar or glucose levels in the blood at a stable level so that our brain and muscles have constant fuel. Insulin is one of the hormones that the pancreas produces and releases. And insulin is released into the bloodstream when blood sugar is high. So insulin almost acts as a key because when insulin is released into the blood, it travels through our bloodstream and binds to receptors that are on the surface of our cells. So it acts like a key that opens up cell membranes to let glucose in. So when insulin binds to receptors on our body cells, such as muscle cells or liver cells, it acts as a key, and the cells will now take that glucose in. This therefore lowers blood sugar levels because the sugar is leaving the bloodstream and being taken up into our cells. So that's the role of insulin. Now, glucagon has the opposite role. So if we look at this diagram here, in response to elevated blood glucose levels, the pancreas secretes insulin. Insulin binds to receptors on our cells, which causes our cells to take in glucose out of the bloodstream, lowering blood glucose levels back to balance. Now, on the alternate side, the other hormone that has the opposite effect is glucagon. When our blood glucose now goes too low, say we've been fasting for a long time, the pancreas secretes glucagon. Glucagon is a hormone that will enter the bloodstream, and it communicates with the liver as well as our muscle tissue as well. And when it binds to receptors in the liver and muscles, it tells our liver and muscle cells to break down any stored energy. So our liver stores sugar in the form of glycogen. Glycogen is a long-chain polysaccharide. And this glucagon is going to bind to cell membranes, and it's going to communicate with the liver to break down that stored energy and release it as glucose into the bloodstream. So it will do this in the liver and also when it binds to muscle cells. It binds those receptors and it signals to the muscle to break down glycogen stores into glucose, releasing that glucose into the blood. Now, blood glucose levels rise. Glucose is mobilized into the bloodstream. It can now travel to the brain. It can travel to other muscle tissues where it can be taken into those cells to be used as energy. So now blood glucose goes back to normal levels. So blood glucose levels need to be maintained within a specific range to be able to support normal bodily function. And in response to any deviations from that internal set point, either insulin pathway or glucagon will be released from the pancreas. And some other hormones here, just quickly, somatostatin inhibits the release of both insulin and glucagon to prevent overcorrection. So once that balance is reached, whether it's in response to glucose having lowered or glucose having elevated, once we maintain that balance again, somatostatin is essentially the signal to say, okay, that's enough insulin, or okay, that's enough glucagon. So somatostatin is this regulator. And finally, pancreatic polypeptide helps to regulate the exocrine secretions that I mentioned before. So pancreatic polypeptide ensures that the digestive side of the pancreas is working in harmony with the hormonal side. Now, when things go wrong in the pancreas and of the cells of the pancreas or in the cells of our body, one of these pathologies is diabetes. So at its core, diabetes mellitus is involving an issue in how our cells receive energy. Type 1 diabetes results from dysfunction in the production and secretion of insulin. Type 2 diabetes involves your target cells becoming resistant to insulin. So one is in the production of insulin, type 1 diabetes, and type 2 diabetes is referring to the cellular responsiveness of insulin. So let's look at this a little bit closer. Now, normally, as I mentioned, insulin acts like a key, right? It binds to receptors on your cells so that glucose, or sugar, can enter your cells. With type 1 diabetes, what happens is the immune system destroys the cells that make insulin in the pancreas. So if the immune system is destroying those islet cells that make insulin in the pancreas, insulin is not produced. As a result, blood sugar levels will rise because insulin will normally be released to reduce blood sugar levels. So if no insulin is produced, these individuals with type 1 diabetes require external insulin injections in order to survive and to regulate their blood glucose levels. So individuals with type 1 diabetes need to take insulin injections. In type 2 diabetes, this usually develops over time, and it's often linked to genetics and lifestyle. So in type 2 diabetes, the body still makes insulin, but now your cells develop insulin resistance. So imagine in this case that your cells act like the lock. And if insulin binds to your cells like a lock or like the key in the lock, now the cell allows glucose in. In the case of type 2 diabetes, insulin is still present and the pancreatic cells are still releasing insulin, but now the lock, which is your cells, are not responsive to that key anymore. So insulin binds and nothing happens on the surface of your cells. This is referred to as insulin resistance. Insulin is present, but your cells are resistant to it. They don't respond by taking in glucose, even if insulin binds. So because the body still makes some insulin in people with type 2 diabetes can be managed by improving cell sensitivity. So reducing that insulin resistance. And this can be accomplished through diet, exercise, and also oral medications that essentially help those locks work better. So the oral medications help your cells to become less resistant to insulin. So in general, some systemic symptoms. Now, if the sugar can't get into your cells, that sugar stays in the blood, and this leads to that condition that we've talked about before, hyperglycemia. If we look at this diagram here, so regardless if insulin is not being produced, therefore blood sugar rises, or your cells are not responding to insulin, so the cells aren't taking in glucose, and therefore that glucose stays in the blood. So in either case, we end up with hyperglycemia. The effects of this include polyuria, which is excessive urination because the kidneys are trying to flush out the excess sugar that's in the blood. Also polydipsia, right? We remember that word, which means excessive thirst because you're urinating so much more. You need to take in more fluids to stay hydrated. Polyphagia, or excessive hunger, because even though your body is, or your blood is full of sugar, your cells are starving because they can't get the energy inside, whether that's because you have no insulin or the cells aren't responding to the insulin. This can be associated with systemic weight loss at times, but things like blurred vision, hyperventilation may occur as a way to try to essentially rid that excess sugar as waste, and that's why some individuals develop a smell of acetone breath, or like a sweetness to the breath, and it causes a slew of gastric symptoms. So there are many symptoms associated with diabetes, and it comes down to either an issue in insulin production or an issue with insulin sensitivity. Now let's move on to the gonads. So the gonads are the reproductive organs in males and females. In females, the ovaries produce, and the main hormone that they produce is estrogens. So estrogens play an important role in many physiological processes. This includes the development of the female reproductive system, the regulation of the menstrual cycle, the development of female secondary sexual characteristics, such as the development of breast tissue. And the ovaries produce another hormone as well, called progesterone. Progesterone contributes to the regulation of the menstrual cycle as well, and it also prepares the body for pregnancy, as well as the maintenance of pregnancy. So these two hormones are really pivotal in the female reproductive system. Males also produce estrogens in low levels, but their main reproductive hormone is testosterone. So the testes primarily produce testosterone, which is a steroid hormone that is important in the development of the male reproductive system, the maturation of sperm cells, and the development of male secondary sexual characteristics like a deepened voice, body hair, and increased muscle mass. Now, in terms of pathologies of the respiratory systems, now, if cancer or growths were to occur within the ovaries and they require removal, this procedure, as we've seen before, is called an oophorectomy. And for the testes, it is an orchidectomy. So these combining forms refer to ovaries and testes respectively. And we can see some various other combining forms. Ones that we mentioned were included throughout the slides of the organs that we've talked about so far. We've seen most of these, and in terms of the use in medical terms, we've looked at oophorectomy. Hyperpituitarism would be increased or greater than activity of the pituitary gland. So we can practice those skills of being able to break down medical terms now that we understand the structures better, and our suffixes to be able to understand what the condition is, such as pancreatitis, inflammation of the pancreas. So that wraps up our look at the endocrine system. Now we are going to look at the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is a slightly more underrepresented system in the body, but we're going to look at how closely the lymphatic system is tied to and works alongside the circulatory system. So we'll see a lot of commonalities in some of the structures, but how they work in tandem, essentially, to support fluid balance and immunity in the body. So the lymphatic system is a highly specialized one-way structural network that consists of lymphatic vessels, which we can see in this image running all throughout the body, as well as lymph nodes and lymphatic ducts. And we'll go into each of these structures in more detail as we move on. But unlike the heart, which pumps blood in a circuit, right, through arteries, capillaries, veins, back to the heart, the lymphatic system only moves in one direction. So the lymphatic system begins from the tissues and back to the heart. So that is the pathway of the lymphatic system, from the tissues back to the heart. Now, every day, about 20 liters of plasma is forced out of your very high-pressured arteries and into the capillaries for gas exchange, right? So as our heart pumps, it sends that blood out, and say we'll focus on a tissue in the arm. So it pumps that blood out to the arm region, and then capillaries infiltrate the tissue in the arm. And that blood is delivered to that tissue to perform gas exchange. It's going to drop off oxygen, pick up wastes, and deliver nutrients. Now, because the walls of those capillaries are very, very thin and very porous as well, the pressure of your heart beating pushes fluid out of the bloodstream and into the spaces that surround the cells that make up that tissue. So if 20 liters of plasma is forced through those arteries and into the capillaries daily, only 17 liters returns to the veins and returns back to the heart in the circulatory system. So that means about 3 liters of fluid is lost to the tissues of the body. It leaves the circuitry of the circulatory system. Now, that leftover fluid is what we call interstitial fluid. It's found between cells in our tissues all throughout the body. If that 3 liters of fluid stayed in our tissues, our blood volume would go down, right? Because that fluid came from the bloodstream. And if it stays in the tissues, blood volume would steadily keep decreasing and decreasing every time fluid got lost in your tissues. This would also result in swelling of our tissues. So our lower legs especially would swell because that fluid's accumulating in the tissues. So the fluid needs to go back into our circulatory system. And this is what the lymphatic system does. The lymphatic system collects that excess fluid in the tissues. The lymphatic vessels in the arm example will open and gather that excess fluid that left the capillaries. Once that fluid is inside of one of these green lymphatic vessels, the fluid there is now called lymph. And we can see lymphatic collector vessels here, right? All these tiny lymphatic capillaries that follow the blood capillaries. And that fluid gets collected from the appendage through these capillaries and to a lymphatic collector vessel. That vessel is then going to travel to a major vein in the body, such as the inferior vena cava, and return that fluid back to the heart. So we can see that happening here. Here's the heart. It's going to pump oxygenated blood out to your tissues, and pretend this capillary bed is in your leg, for example. In the tissues of your leg, oxygenated blood is going to be delivered here. Oxygen enters your tissue cells. Wastes are going to leave the tissue cells and enter the bloodstream. But as that oxygen and nutrients are leaving the blood to enter the tissue cells, so too is fluid. So plasma fluid is leaving the circulatory system. Here we have our lymphatic system. It's going to pick up that fluid, carry it through a lymphatic vessel. Now, these vessels begin as lymphatic capillaries, which are very small, and they feed into larger and larger lymphatic vessels. Eventually, these will empty through a series of ducts, pass through a lymph node, and then the main duct drops it off into the bloodstream. So we'll come back to these lymphatic capillaries. Now, what happens is in your tissues here, any bacteria that exists within that tissue fluid will be taken up by the lymphatic capillaries. So say you had a cut or a wound, and some bacteria got into the tissues there. Your lymphatic vessels are going to take up that excess fluid, but also the bacteria. And the lymphatic capillaries feed into lymphatic vessels. And it's going to carry this fluid, which is now called lymph, to a lymph node. These lymph nodes are located all throughout your body. Humans have about 500 to 600 lymph nodes all throughout the body. And within these lymph nodes is immune cells. And these immune cells are going to destroy pathogens. So the function of these lymph nodes is to remove debris and pathogens from the lymph. So as fluid enters a lymph node, it passes through an internal filter that traps any infectious pathogens, bacteria, viruses. Lymphatic vessels will then merge to a lymphatic trunk. And the lymphatic trunk would be represented by this region here, is going to collect lymph from the smaller lymphatic vessels, finally depositing that lymph back into our venous circulation, in this case into the vena cava. By doing this, the lymphatic system ensures that our blood volume remains constant and our tissues stay cleansed and functional. So as we can see, the lymphatic system and the immune system are functionally tied to one another. While the lymphatic system provides that structural network of vessels and lymph nodes, the lymphatic fluid is going to contain specialized immune cells. This includes lymphocytes, macrophages, right? Those phagocytic cells that take in harmful substances and break them down. These cells will inhabit the network to monitor the body for pathogens that could cause disease. Lymphocytes are our primary cells of the adaptive immune system. So lymphocytes have memory functions, and they are able to produce our antibodies in the case of a B cell here, or T cells are involved in forming a memory to pathogens that we've been exposed to before. This way, if we're infected with the same pathogen twice, we can mount a faster immune response. So these lymphocytes are part of the adaptive immune system. Both B cells and T cells, which are the two main types of lymphocytes here, develop in our bone marrow. Immune cells are constantly, and all of these cells are constantly performing surveillance by patrolling the interstitial spaces between cells, that interstitial fluid. And when these cells encounter a foreign invader, they enter the lymphatic vessels to return to, or before returning to the circulatory system, they enter the lymphatic vessels and reach a lymph node in order to neutralize that pathogen. In addition, the cells that are patrolling the lymphatic system also communicate with other cells to ensure a coordinated and systemic response to any types of pathogens. So the lymph nodes serve as these central checkpoints to filter out those debris and pathogens and trigger the activation of those lymphocytes. So there are various organs that play a role in the functions of the immune system, and these are called lymphoid organs. So there are primary lymphoid organs, and they're called primary because they produce these immune cells. We have red bone marrow, which is a primary lymphoid organ where B cells are a type of lymphocyte. B cells undergo nearly all of their development in bone marrow. Bone marrow is found in the ends of our long bones, such as in the femur. In the bone marrow, T cells, that other type of lymphocyte, are produced, but they're immature at this point. And T cells will then migrate from the bone marrow to the thymus gland, that gland right here in the chest area. And T cells will become mature and immunocompetent, or able to perform their functions in the thymus. We also have the spleen. The spleen is considered to be a major secondary lymphoid organ. It's about 5 inches long, and it's pretty fragile. It doesn't have a strong capsule around it, and it's sometimes referred to as the filter of the blood because the spleen is very highly vascularized. And what it does is it filters the blood of any microbes, pathogens, and also stores and destroys worn out red blood cells. So those are the functions of the spleen. Now, the tonsils are lymphoid structures in the oral region, and they act as guards to the mucosal entries. So the mouth, they're protecting the digestive system or the gut. And this is lymphatic tissue that contains many immune cells to help with fighting oral pathogens and helping with developing immunity early on at this opening of the body. And we have lymphoid nodules. So lymphoid nodules are patches of lymphoid tissue, such as these Peyer's patches in the small intestine. And they are simpler than lymph nodes in that they consist of simply a dense cluster of lymphocytes. They don't have any surrounding fibrous capsule. So these nodules, which are just clusters of lymphocytes, are located in the digestive tract, in the respiratory tract as well. Because these areas are routinely exposed to environmental pathogens, right? So any microbes that we ingest, or for the respiratory system, any microbes, pathogens, bacteria, viruses that we inhale, these lymphoid nodules are found in these systems, the respiratory and digestive, to be able to fight off those pathogens there. So as we can see, these organs consist of specialized tissue that have roles of either producing immune cells, like our primary lymphoid organs, or fighting off infections are filtering lymph or blood, right? Our lymph nodes filter lymph. Lymphocytes become activated in lymph nodes where they accumulate and fight off infections or debris. The spleen filters blood. And the tonsils and lymphoid, oh, I see a spelling error here. Sorry about that. And lymphoid nodules are going to be responsible for guarding either mucosal entries or existing within the systems to be able to fight off any infections. So we can see these combining forms for these specific structures. We've seen lympho for lymph fluid, a lymphocyte, as we've seen, is a cell of the lymphatic system. We can see, we've seen these before, spleno, so splenectomy would be removal of the spleen if it becomes inflamed. Thymo referring to the thymus gland, and tonsillo referring to the tonsils. So these combining forms represent those terms that we've seen for the lymphatic system. Please stay tuned for part 3, where we will wrap up with the rest of the lymphatic system in terms of lymphatic system pathologies.